The M10 tank destroyer was on fire. Flames were licking up from the engine compartment, spreading toward the hull where hundreds of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and high-explosive shells were cooking in the heat. The crew was dead. The vehicle was a coffin wrapped in burning steel, and Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy was climbing onto it. Behind him, 19 exhausted men were retreating into the Colmore woods. They weren't cowards. They were the survivors of Company B, the remnants of a unit that had been shredded by German artillery and was now facing a counterattack by 250 elite German infantry, supported by 6 heavy tanks. The mathematics of survival said retreat. The officers who outranked Murphy had already withdrawn. The manual said consolidate, regroup, fight another day. Murphy wasn't following the manual. He was 5 feet 5 inches tall. He weighed 130 pounds soaking wet. He looked more like a high school sophomore than a combat officer. The Army had initially rejected him for being too small. The Marines had rejected him. The paratroopers had rejected him. He had lied about his age to get into the infantry. And even then, he had been assigned to Cook's training because nobody believed he could survive frontline combat. On January 26, 1945, that undersized reject was about to become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. The German counterattack had begun at dawn. The Wehrmacht knew that the American lines at Holtzwihr were thin, held by units that had been fighting for weeks without proper rest or reinforcement. Company B had started the day with over 100 men. By noon, they were down to 19. The German assault had been methodical and brutal. Artillery first to soften the positions, then infantry to exploit the gaps. When the German tanks appeared through the snow-covered fields, Murphy knew the position was lost. The M10 that was supposed to provide anti-tank support took an 88 mm shell through the hull. The explosion killed 2 of the 3 crew members instantly. The third crawled out of the wreck, his uniform on fire, and collapsed in the snow. Murphy helped drag the survivor to safety. Then he looked at the burning vehicle and made a calculation that no sane person would make. The M10's .50 caliber machine gun was still mounted on the turret. The vehicle was on fire, but the flames hadn't reached the ammunition yet. The hull was filled with gasoline and explosives that could detonate at any moment. Standing on that vehicle would be like standing on a bomb with a burning fuse. But the .50 caliber could reach the German infantry at ranges where their rifles couldn't effectively respond. The machine gun could provide suppressive fire while Murphy's men retreated. The burning hull would provide cover of a sort. The Germans might not expect anyone to be crazy enough to use a burning wreck as a fighting position. Murphy told his men to fall back to the tree line. They stared at him. The sergeant tried to argue. Murphy pulled rank and repeated the order. Fall back. Get to cover. Wait for his signal. Then he climbed onto the burning M10 and put his hands on the machine gun. The first Germans to appear in his sights were infantry, moving in loose formation across the open field. They were professionals, veterans of the Eastern Front, who had fought Soviets in conditions as brutal as anything the Western Front could offer. They advanced with the confidence of men who expected to sweep aside whatever resistance remained. Murphy opened fire. The .50 caliber hammered across the frozen landscape, the heavy rounds kicking up snow and dirt and bodies. The rate of fire was devastating. 500 rounds per minute that could reach out to 1,000 yards with lethal accuracy. The first burst killed 3 men and sent a dozen more diving for cover. The Germans redirected their fire toward the burning M10. Rifle rounds cracked past Murphy's head. Machine gun tracers drew lines through the air around him. The hull of the tank destroyer rang like a bell as rounds struck the armor plating. Murphy kept firing. He was exposed from the waist up, silhouetted against the flames that were now climbing higher behind him. Every German soldier in the field could see exactly where he was. Every German tank was traversing its turret toward his position. He was a single standing figure on a burning platform, inviting the concentrated fire of an entire enemy force. The first German tank fired. The shell passed over Murphy's head and exploded in the tree line behind him. The tank gunner had aimed high, perhaps uncertain of the range, perhaps distracted by the flames and smoke surrounding the target. Murphy didn't flinch. He kept firing at the infantry, knowing that the tanks would eventually find their range. The calculation was simple. Every second he survived was another second for his men to reach cover. Every German soldier he killed was one less soldier to pursue the retreat. Every round he fired bought time that couldn't be measured in normal terms. The second tank fired. This shell struck the ground in front of the M10, showering Murphy with frozen dirt and shrapnel. A fragment caught him in the leg. He felt the impact, felt the warmth of blood spreading down his calf, and kept firing. The Germans were trying to flank him now. Infantry was working around both sides of the burning vehicle, attempting to get angles where the machine gun couldn't track them. Murphy traversed the .50 caliber in a continuous arc, sweeping from left to right and back again, forcing the flanking elements to keep their heads down. But he couldn't hold the position alone, not with 6 tanks and 200 infantry closing from multiple directions. He needed something more than the machine gun. Murphy keyed his radio. The artillery observer who answered was located several miles behind the lines, coordinating fire support for the entire sector. Murphy gave him a grid reference. The observer asked him to confirm. Murphy confirmed. The observer told him that the grid reference he had provided was his own position. "I know exactly where I am," Murphy said. "Fire the mission." The artillery began falling 60 yards from the burning M10. The shells screamed down through the gray sky and exploded in the open field, throwing up fountains of frozen earth and shrapnel. The German infantry advance faltered. Men dove for craters and shell holes, seeking protection from the barrage. But artillery alone couldn't stop tanks. The 6 German vehicles were still advancing, their armor impervious to the artillery fragments that were shredding the infantry. Murphy watched them approach and continued firing the machine gun, knowing that the .50 caliber couldn't penetrate their armor, but hoping to damage optics, destroy vision blocks, maybe kill a commander who was stupid enough to stand in an open hatch. The third tank fired. The shell struck the rear of the M10, adding another explosion to the fire that was already consuming the vehicle. Murphy felt the hull shudder beneath his feet. The flames were climbing higher now, spreading toward the ammunition storage that would end everything in a single catastrophic detonation. He didn't dismount. He kept firing. The engagement lasted 1 hour, 60 minutes of continuous combat, standing on a burning vehicle that should have exploded a dozen times over. Murphy went through ammunition belts until the barrel of the .50 caliber was glowing white-hot. He called in artillery adjustments until the observer begged him to withdraw. He killed Germans until the snow around the M10 was stained with their blood. The German infantry began retreating first. They had lost over 50 men to Murphy's machine gun and the artillery he was directing. The survivors decided that the thin American line wasn't worth the cost of taking it. They began pulling back across the fields they had crossed with such confidence an hour earlier. The tanks followed. With their infantry support gone, the armored vehicles were vulnerable to close assault by any Americans who had survived the engagement. The tank commanders decided to wait for another opportunity rather than press the attack alone. Murphy watched them retreat. He watched the smoke rising from the burning M10. He felt the heat of the flames on his back and the cold of the January wind on his face. Then the ammunition finally started cooking off. The rounds began detonating in the hull below him, the heat having finally reached the threshold where the propellant ignited. Murphy threw himself off the vehicle and rolled into the snow as explosions ripped through the M10. Shrapnel whistled over his head. Secondary detonations sent shell casings spinning into the air. He had dismounted approximately 30 seconds before the entire vehicle disintegrated. Murphy limped back to the tree line where his men were waiting. His leg was bleeding from the shrapnel wound. His uniform was scorched from the flames. His hands were burned from handling the white-hot machine gun. He had been exposed to sub-zero temperatures for an hour without proper cold weather gear. He reorganized his 19 men and led a counterattack. The Germans, demoralized by the hour they had spent trying to kill one man on a burning tank destroyer, broke and ran when the Americans emerged from the woods. Murphy's tiny force recaptured the ground they had lost that morning, taking the positions that 250 German infantry and 6 tanks had been unable to hold. When the after-action reports were compiled, The numbers were almost impossible to believe. 1 man, 1 machine gun, 1 burning vehicle, over 50 German soldiers killed, 6 tanks repelled, an entire counterattack broken. The Army awarded Audie Murphy the Medal of Honor for his actions at Holtzwihr. The citation described how he had mounted the burning tank destroyer, which was in danger of blowing up at any moment, and employed its 50 caliber machine gun against the enemy. It described how he had killed or wounded 50 Germans and directed artillery fire which killed many more. It described how he had held his position and continued to fire the machine gun until his ammunition was exhausted. The citation did not describe the look on his face when he climbed onto the burning M10. It did not describe the calculations he had made, trading certain death on the vehicle for possible death in retreat. It did not describe the 19 men who watched him disappear into the smoke and flames, certain they were seeing their lieutenant die. Murphy had enlisted in the army at 17 after lying about his age. He had been orphaned, raised in poverty in rural Texas, forced to support his younger siblings after his mother died and his father abandoned the family. He had joined the military because it was the only option left for a kid with no education and no prospects. He finished the war as the most decorated American soldier in history. 28 medals, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. He had killed 240 enemy soldiers over the course of his service. He had been wounded 3 times. He had never asked to be relieved of duty. After the war, Murphy became a Hollywood actor. He played cowboys and soldiers in films that never quite captured the reality of what combat actually felt like. He suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe PTSD, sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow, plagued by nightmares that never faded. He died in a plane crash in 1971 at the age of 45. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The grave marker lists his medals but cannot convey the hour he spent on a burning tank destroyer while an entire German force tried to kill him. The men who served with Murphy told his story for the rest of their lives. They told it to their children and grandchildren. They described the 5'5" kid who looked too small for combat but fought like he was 10 feet tall. They described the moment he climbed onto the M10 and told them to fall back. They described the fear they felt watching him disappear into the flames. "We thought he was dead," one of them said in an interview decades later. "We were sure of it. Nobody survives standing on a burning wreck for an hour while 6 tanks shoot at them. Nobody does that." He paused, remembering. But Audie did. He just stayed there and kept shooting until there was nobody left to shoot at. And then he came back and led us in a charge, like it was nothing. Like he hadn't just done something impossible. The M10 tank destroyer that Murphy used as his fighting position was never recovered. The vehicle burned completely, reduced to a twisted hulk of melted steel and ash. The 50 caliber machine gun that had been his only weapon against 250 soldiers was destroyed in the final detonation. But the position held. The German counterattack was broken. The line that should have collapsed remained intact. And 19 men who should have been overrun lived to see the end of the war because a 5'5" lieutenant decided that retreat was not an option. They left him to die on a burning wreck. He stayed there anyway, and when the smoke cleared, he was still standing, and the Germans were running. Some stories are too extreme to be believed. Some acts of courage exceed what any reasonable person considers possible. Some men fight because they have no other choice, and some men fight because they refuse to accept any other outcome. Audie Murphy was 5 feet 5 inches tall. He weighed 130 pounds. The Army had rejected him for being too small. The Marines had rejected him. The paratroopers had rejected him. None of them rejected him after Holtzwihr. If Murphy's story of impossible courage hit you the way it hit me, smash that like button right now. Every like tells the algorithm that soldiers who became legends deserve to be remembered. If you're not subscribed, now is the time, because next week we're uncovering another warrior who defied every odd and rewrote military history. Drop a comment and answer honestly. If your tank destroyer was burning and your men were retreating, would you have climbed onto the flames or fallen back with your squad? I want to know. I'll see you in the next one.